Professor Howard Williams takes you on a journey through time and space, exploring death and memory, past and present. Archaeodeath.
Archaeodeathlings, it's Professor of Archaeology Howard Williams here, and on the 28th of November I gave a public lecture to the Cardiff Archaeological Society with an audience of 50 with the title Once Were Vikings, New Archaeologies of Today's Viking Worlds, and I thought I'd share the slides and some of the key points of that lecture to you, my Archaeodeath internet audience. Now this relates to the broader ways in which we as academics are responsible to and can critically investigate today's Vikingisms, the many Viking worlds that exist in our 21st century politics, society and popular culture. And here's a montage of images to give you an impression of the variety of ways in which the history and archaeology of the Viking Age has continued to resonate in our societies, in fiction, in the arts, in public spaces and public gatherings, as well as our online education, our museum and heritage sectors. And this has been a field that I've been increasingly commenting on and critically investigating through my research as a teacher and a scholar of early medieval archaeology, including the Viking Age. And I want to present two areas in which my work has been tackling the Vikingisms of our day. So it's digging into 21st century Vikingisms rather than simply the Viking Age. So it's about how we use our expertise as academics, our voices as public intellectuals, to talk about the relationship between our specialist fields and broader conversations in contemporary society. Now the first area I want to tackle is my ongoing research digging into, exploring critically today's necro-Vikings, death and burial in the Viking world as it's perceived in contemporary society. Now directly through museums and heritage sites, but also via historical dramas that represent the Viking Age, archaeological discoveries and ideas have informed the way in which we represent the Viking Age in life, but also in death rituals. We now have a very fixed and often stereotyped understanding of Viking death and burial that informs not only our contemporary funerary industry and aspirations by pagan groups and those that are affine to the Viking past, but also a broader popular culture of how we might die like a Viking, but also various fictional worlds, not only historical dramas but also fantasy genres from the Marvel universe, in this case an image screen captured from Thor the Dark World from 2013, a Game of Thrones and the Middle-earth universe of the world of Tolkien, as represented here in the Death of Boromir in the Fellowship of the Ring from 2001, and the popular TV series that ran for 5 seasons and then a film, The Last Kingdom, and here from 2022 a scene of a on-land boat burial. And all of this stems from a popular fascination in the role of ships and boats in early medieval funerary practice, not exclusively Viking, but also the Old English poem Beowulf, inspiring the Tolkien representation of Boromir's boat funeral in the original books. We also have, of course, stemming from the 1958 film The Vikings, where flaming arrows are shot into a longship which floats out across the waves, saying goodbye to the anti-hero of the story, Einar. So we have many overlapping historical and fantasy Viking funerals that are seen as key ways in which we think about the past, and the past informs our present popular culture. And one recent example of this that I've only a few weeks ago encountered because of an ongoing controversy about the casting of characters in the live action version of the first film in the franchise that will be coming out next year is the Viking funeral in a purely kids fantasy world of How to Train Your Dragon. And this is from How to Train Your Dragon 2 from 2014, where we have a very powerful and moving scene where the death of Stoik the Vast, the chieftain and leader of the Vikings of Berk, who dies in tragic circumstances, and his son has to lead the funeral procession with his mother, who he's recently become reacquainted with and thought had died, and the rest of the Vikings after their defeat by the baddie. And so the funeral is an important part of the arc, the story arc, as the characters try to find a common goal to push back and fight back against their enemies, and eventually they secure victory. So it's part of a moment where we see tragedy, we see mourning, and then we see a social reconsolidation towards the conclusion of the film. And all the characters fire flaming arrows into a longship where the body of Stoik is covered by a white cloth with his horned helmet, obviously something we know is a fiction. It's part of our fictional fantasy Viking world still, including in How to Train Your Dragon, but this is a world of horned helmets and dragons that are real, and his boat is set alight. And this type of funeral has some groundings in the archaeological and historical worlds of the Viking Age. I mean, we know that ships were deployed widely as imagery, as stone settings, as actual physical vessels that were buried on land and cremated on land. But while we don't have conclusive evidence that ships were set alight and let drift off over the water, whether it's on a river, a lake, a fjord, or the open sea, we do have a few literary references. Notably in Heimskringla, the Sea King Haki is self-immolates on his ship with his warriors' corpses, and we also have the Prose Edda recording the death of the god Balder, and the aforementioned funeral from the Old English poem Beowulf of Skjold Seafing, who isn't burnt on water but is set out with a cargo of treasures over the water, mirroring how he arrived in a Moses-like fashion in a vessel as a foundling, as a child. So while as a representation of modern popular culture, the funeral in How to Train Your Dragon 2 is so disconnected from our academic understanding of the Viking Age that it'd be easy to mock. But in terms of the emotional outpouring of the characters, the personal eulogy for their leader, and the way it fits into a classic Hertzian sociological narrative of death as transition, where the boat, through fire and through transportation over the water, physically transforms the corpse, while a sense of the soul is heading on a journey during this funerary period to an afterlife, is articulated in the eulogy by the Gobba, one of the characters, who says, you know, he is going off to be with the chiefs and kings in Valhalla, so Odin's hall for the slain. And we also get a sense that the characters themselves, most importantly, are socially going through a transformation to reorientate themselves under a new leader of their son Hiccup to re-engage with the enemy. It all fits into the power of funerals in our popular culture, and particularly the trope of the Viking funeral, the stereotype of the Viking funeral, as a means in which we can think about the power of these open-air, spectacular theatres of death that do have roots in our understanding of the Viking world, if indirectly and fantastically explored in fiction. They do connect us to our understandings of death rituals in the Viking Age as performances that are about transforming the body, the soul, and the survivors. And in that regard, these fictional worlds provide evidence of how our ideas have percolated through into popular culture, but also they're important conversation points, the ways we can get people educated about what we know about the Viking Age. They may not have read much detailed archaeological investigations or many historical accounts, but they may have seen these films. And if this is a way, an avenue, a gateway into those deeper conversations about the past and the present, about mortality and how archaeology can facilitate dialogues with death and the dead, then this is an important field of ongoing investigation. There are many of these Viking funerals, and many take place on land, but some again repeatedly return to this 1958 The Vikings trope of burning in boats on the sea. And the most recent example of this is actually this year in the third and final season of the television show Vikings Valhalla, itself a spin-off of the popular Vikings TV show. Now, Vikings was set in the 9th century and perhaps into the early 10th century, as in the final season you're looking at the early Viking Age, but Vikings Valhalla jumps a century and a bit to look at the early 11th century, and here we're shown a ludicrous but engaging funeral of a very famous Scandinavian ruler, that of Canute the Great. And so at the very end, the culmination of this television show, they cannot let Canute go out as a Christian king to be buried in Winchester in the Minster alone. Oh no, he has to have a formal Christian burial, but then in secret Queen Emma here stands alone on the headland above the White Cliffs of Dover to witness a conflagration in a longship of her husband's corpse, like a Viking, celebrating his Viking heritage, already almost an anachronism of its time, but here shown as a part of that Scandinavian heritage, and a lone loyal retainer fires a single flaming arrow to set light to this funerary ship. So Canute gets cremated like a Viking, and this idea of a fictional Viking ethnicity heritage is built into this vision of the Viking Age and Viking death ritual. And at its core, this is a fantasy. This is feeding into white supremacist discourse on the Vikings as a distinctive warrior culture, but in other ways it chimes with potential ways we can think about death as a journey, as a transition that links us to past and to aspired futures. And in that regard, we can see a lot of rich ways in which these historical dramas, as well as fantasy genre films, books, television shows and so on, allow us to connect to something that has authentic roots, even if it is beyond the realms of historical sources to speculate that this actually happened. It is taking many liberties with our source material, but it does portray a legendary Viking Age in which pagan and Christian mash up and are confused over centuries of syncretism. And it's important to remember that in addition to that, we have many science fiction Vikingisms. We've already seen the Marvel universe as one example of fictional Vikings, but we also have science fictional Vikings in many iterations in the long-running children's TV show Doctor Who. And here are three examples. We have The Girl Who Died, a girl who is from a village of Vikings who combats with the Doctor's help against space Vikings who are trying to pretend to be gods, and after succeeding she is given alien technology that allows us to live to it forever, which becomes a curse for her as she sees the world unfold and she constantly regenerates. Then we have the Doctor in an earlier incarnation of Matt Smith, rather than Peter Capaldi in The Girl Who Died. Matt Smith hides his own death from the silence by cremating his body in a canoe in Utah in the United States. But this is a kind of stylized Viking conflagration funeral that is a deception to conceal his ongoing life. And finally, we have in a more recent version a cremation in the 9th century of a recon scout Dalek that is finally defeated and its corpse split up into three parts by its many armies of the 9th century who share forces, one led by a Viking warrior woman, to defeat this one Viking, and the Viking the Dalek, this one Dalek, sorry, and the Dalek is then cremated. So we have this mixture of fictional Vikings where cremation and on land and on water and ideas of mortality and immortality play out in our popular culture. Now, another enduring reference to necro-Vikingisms is the Japanese manga and then anime Vinland Saga, where there are allusions to these stylized portrayals of Viking funerals, and they have important places to play in the narrative, but there are also other spiritual and grim, historically realistic representations of funerals that don't play into these tropes. But let's deal with the trope first. This is the funeral of Thors, who is a Jomsviking, a captain of these hyper-military mercenaries, but we learn that this is actually a fake funeral, a cenotaphic funeral, because his body is lost. So the Jomsvikings believe he is dead, and they cremate a ship to honour his passing, like a Viking. But then we learn that Thors has escaped to live a peaceful life in Iceland with his wife and newborn child. And so you get the sense that he escapes the world of violence and slave taking of the Jomsvikings to live the life of a real warrior in peace. Now, this doesn't work out for Thors, who ends up being found by the Jomsvikings, who demand he joins their combat, but then is trapped and killed. But his son, Thorfinn, takes up the search for revenge, has to rejoin that Viking life, but then realizes its futility, and like his father before him, tries to seek a journey to a peaceful life. But Iceland isn't far enough, and he envisages a future world in Vinland, as told to him by Leif Erikson, who says that there will be a place away from slavery and away from violence. And so in season 2, we see Thorfinn Karlsefni, having fought many a battle and slain many an enemy, get punished by King Canute through enslavement, but with the help of a sidekick who is also enslaved, tries to seek out Vinland as both a kind of real world paradise and a spiritual escape. En route, we see the gruesome nature of the world of the 11th century, with slaves discarded overboard when they become sick, of a Mercia ravaged by war and violence, with corpses in fields, bodies being given shallow burial, and heads impaled on stakes, as well as large fresh cemeteries of the war dead. We also see Thorfinn plagued by the demons of his past, as the undead forces of his victims struggle to reach him and drag him down back to his world of violence that he has tried to leave behind. And we see other ways in which the dead spiritually interact with the living. This is the head of Svein Forkbeard, the father of Canute the Great, who mocks and derides his son, but also guides his son, and through the many brutal Machiavellian decisions he makes in his quest for expanded and enduring power. Canute's vision to create a paradise on earth that's not a holy one, but one of order under his hegemony. In addition to that, the TV show's second season shows us many visions into afterlife journeys, and particularly those of slaves, who are the subject to the brutality of the Viking world. So here we have the slave Garda, who kills his master and escapes, but ends up being slain, and then while riding in a cart with his beloved Arnheid, with whom he's been reunited, drifts off into death. And as he does so, he envisages himself in another cart going on a desolate road through a dark landscape in which other slaves who are abandoned are not going to reach a destination, and he sees one of them, and one of them is himself as an enslaved person. So he is both travelling through a dark and subterranean landscape, but simultaneously he is envisaging alternative fates for himself, where he may never have reached an afterlife, and he does finally reach his dead son in a beautiful idyllic farm from whence he had left to go to war many years earlier. And then in the second image you see when Arnheid is herself brutally attacked by her master Kettle and passes into death. She imagines she is in a cart being transported with her husband, her dead child, and her as yet unborn baby, who has died ahead of her and causes her own death, in a cart through a desolate wilderness. So we get this kind of vision of death as a journey. And so the Vinland saga is not so much about reconstructing Viking historical and archaeologically precise death ritual, and death is more about escaping the horrors and the brutality, the inequality and the violence of our world. And indeed, Arnheid's grave, a focus of mourning and floral offerings, a monolith on a sea cliff overlooking the waters, it becomes a key pivot in the storyline of season 2, where she passes away and is honoured, and this therefore inspires Einar and Thorfinn to redouble their efforts to reach Vinland, a land that Arnheid herself would have loved, escaping from violence and enslavement. And the grave becomes the motivator, the catalyst for their ongoing journey to seek out Vinland, a place that is both spiritually pure, we've seen as a sort of in a dream-like vision, as a place free from torment and toil, and as a real-world destination to escape the wars and slavery of Denmark in the early 11th century. And so when they finally get back to Iceland, they re-encounter a grave that we see at the very beginning of season 1, the grave of a slave that Thorfinn's father Thors had tried to save and purchase, but who died of his wounds and his suffering, and is given a grave like Arnheid's on a headland looking out to sea. And just as Garda and Arnheid's deaths as journeys in wagons is supposed to be seen in parallel, as journeys to the next world, so the graves in our world of Arnheid and this unnamed slave provide the pivots around which the story has developed, and around which the journey to Vinland begins and is provoked, is inspired. Now, the only funerary landscape we see in the 2 seasons, in actual fact, is in the opening credits of a set of ship settings in stone with mounds within, that is semi-fictional, semi-inspired by archaeological landscapes such as the Lindholm Hoya Cemetery from Jutland. But that's less important than the centrality of death and dying, and visions of Vinland as a way out of the cycles of violence and inequality in our world that are central to the story's drive. So looking at this as an archaeologist, the material landscapes and the way in depth the graves are less important in terms of their drawing on specific archaeological sources, and more as in terms of their power of death in the storylines to drive the motivations of the characters. Now, these necro-Vikingisms are a focus of my ongoing research, and I've contributed a co-authored chapter on death and the dead in the TV show Vikings series 1 to 4 in a book edited by Hardwick and Lister, Vikings and the Vikings, Essays on Television's History Channel series, and also a chapter on my own looking at the funerals specifically in Vikings seasons 1 to 4 in a book I've co-edited called The Public Archaeology of Death. And I have a forthcoming chapter on the necro-Vikingisms in season 5 of Vikings, which aired from 2017 to 2019, out in a forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Death and Burial in the Viking Age. But there's a further point and a final point I want to raise about the necro-Vikings that we see in our popular culture, and that is that as well as being many hiding in plain sight that we may not recognise as necro-Vikingisms, we also have examples that help us, motivate us, and help us inspire us into how to think about our role as public intellectuals and activists, how we can use our academic knowledge about the Viking Age to effect change and to contribute to broader debates in our world. And this comes from a 2019 blog post I composed on my Archaeodeath blog, V for Viking, Fighting Norse Fire with Fire, that I subsequently wrote up for a book chapter. Namely, my argument is that I identify the funeral of the vigilante V, the anti-hero or hero in the Moore and Lloyd classic graphic novel, V for Vendetta, as a largely unrecognised, even in the literature about the comic books, Viking funeral in our popular culture. In fact, it may be, both through the comic books themselves and subsequently the film directed by James McTeague from 2005, the most well-known Viking funeral. And while the film doesn't explicitly and fully outline the Vikingisms, the original graphic novel, chapter 11, is called Valhalla, where V asks Evie to give him a Viking funeral. And the Viking funeral is both his mode of disposal through conflagration, but also the way in which he finally inflicts the final act of destruction on his enemies, the Norse Fire government, the fascist regime that he is hoping to destroy. So in the comic book, he destroys Downing Street. In the film, it's the Houses of Parliament, like the Guy Fawkes that his persona is mimicked upon. That he actually does what Guy Fawkes fails to do in the Gunpowder Plot. He destroys Parliament. But in both versions, the funeral, the underground passage of a vessel, in this case an underground train, to a fiery end, parallels the idea of the Viking funeral in our popular culture. And Evie takes up the mask of V in the original comic books and becomes the new Vidar, the sort of post-Ragnarok incarnation of the gods, to live on in a new world, whereas in the film everyone becomes the new V and starts again with the destruction of the Norse Fire government. But different iterations and different scales of optimism, but different ways in which the Viking funeral is seen as not only the death of a hero, but also a mechanism for social and political change. And I think that also serves not only as another example in our popular culture of Vikings, but also an analogy for how we should do our public engagement, our public education, our public activism, that rather than run away from the complex and dangerous discourses of the Vikings, that we face them head on. We fight fire with fire. We use these popular cultures, we use these popular sources to constructively engage in the messy fictions, the fascism, the white supremacy, the militarism of Vikings in our popular culture. Rather than just denounce them, we use these media in a constructive way to have conversations that have broader cultural and political impact. And that's why I feel that Viking scholars do have a lot to say, even though in direct terms of authenticity there is little in these genres that link to our source material. They are Vikingisms. We are implicated in the broader conversations, and rather than deny it, we should accept and develop the way in which we interact with these popular culture Vikingisms. And I've written that argument up in a 2023 book chapter in a book edited by Claire Kennan and Emma Jane Wells, What is Medieval? Decoding Approaches to the Medieval and Medievalism in the 21st Century, and my chapter is called V for Viking. So that's my first half, where I look at necro-Vikingisms as an integral part of our popular culture, some hiding in plain sight, and this is an important vein of public education and conversation where our expertise interacts with our popular culture. My second point is that we can do much more to explicitly tackle not only misinformation and disinformation, but these popular and engaging ways in which the Vikings operate in contemporary political discourse and popular culture. And here I want to move from me as an academic critiquing popular culture to being participatory in it through social media. And here I want to talk about digital Vikingisms. Now, since 2013, I mentioned before I do a blog called Archaeologies. Since 2013, I've done many posts with a broader popular engagement on many aspects of the archaeology and heritage of death and memory. And one clear strand of this has been discussing these issues about how we tackle the many fantasies and misinformation and disinformation about the Vikings in our contemporary world, from museums, heritage sites, through to TV shows, and indeed critiquing our own research produced by academics and how it's being promoted, used and misused in popular culture. And I've extended this to conversations and presentations on YouTube from April 2020, which has gained a modest audience, but a bigger audience via short form video on TikTok from May 2020, where among many other topics I address to do with mortuary archaeology, medieval archaeology, heritage, I address Vikings and Vikingisms by sharing and critiquing new discoveries and research, responding to questions, critiquing heritage, popular culture and political Vikingisms, and combating misinformation and disinformation, doing some debunking and critiquing and challenging and sometimes using humour to mock these various misconceptions and misunderstandings. So in a host of ways, using my social media platform to bring the fight, to fight fire with fire, to bring the challenge to these many popular cultures and misinformations. And let me give you some examples of this from my social media on TikTok over the last 6 months, although you could also look at my blog and my YouTube channel for further examples, and my older TikToks for even more expanded instances where I've done this critiquing and sharing of discoveries and research, responding to questions, critiquing popular culture, heritage and political Vikingisms, and overtly challenging misinformation and disinformation. But this is just some examples from the last 6 months. So here's just a run through of some classic examples. So a key question that people want to know more about on popular culture and in popular social media, and there's a lot of misinformation about, is what is a Viking? Who were the Vikings? With reaction to the idea that Vikings were a white supremacist, a pure people, a culture, an ethnicity, a race. Those terms overlap in popular culture, by saying, oh, it was just a profession, it was a job, it was an occupation. And I try to make the point based on my reading, and here I'm representing a scholarship, not just my own research, but representing the work of others. I've tried to argue that neither seeing Vikings as a people or as a job is helpful, and both can be co-opted by white supremacist and ethno-nationalist discourses in a range of different places and fashions. And instead we need to understand the evolution of the terminology and its different uses in the present day. So here's some examples of me challenging that by people who are evoking archaeological evidence, rune stones, written sources to say the Vikings was a job, and those who would try and claim it was a people, an ethnicity, who operated with a particular biological appearance, particular phenotypes, and you can see how this feeds into racism and xenophobia. A key other dimension is misinformation about where did the Vikings come from, and the nature of Viking voyages, their exploration, their raiding, their trading, their military expeditions, and their colonization or settlement. And so here we see examples of videos where I've tried to combat not necessarily things that are wrong, but are misframed or misconceptualized about where the Vikings came from and where they got to. You know, for example, people talking about Viking empires, or people talking about Viking settlement in North America and giving the impression there was some enduring long presence of the Norse beyond Greenland to the west. People claim that Irish was spoken in North America 1,000 years ago based on a ring pin found at a Hiberno Norse ringed pin found at Lonsa Meadows. And while of course I talk about the Celtic speaking people's contribution to the Viking diaspora, the Norse settlement of the North Atlantic islands, I also qualify that by saying that we have many challenges in making those assumptions about language, and it can be misused by white nationalists, and particularly Irish Americans, in creating a deep time claims to North American settler colonialism. So there's many ways in which this can be misused or misunderstood. I've also do a lot of interactions with other political commentators and archaeologists on the app, challenging and debunking classic hoaxes about the Viking Age, such as the Kensington runestone from Minnesota, and sharing new research on the Viking Age and how we interpret it in a pop culture format, such as looking at the new research on the sources of silver coins used in early medieval coins in the North Sea zone. So I'm able to bring the new academic research produced by others into popular conversations, to both challenging fake news and pseudo-archaeology, pseudo-history, as well as sharing new information and challenging misinformation. And here I talk about, in this video where I stitch Stefan, who's a Norwegian archaeologist, I talk about the need for trained archaeologists to do this reporting rather than relying on lazy or second-hand information by journalists, which can often get points wrong or emphasize the wrong things. There's a lot of interest online for Viking societies, how they were composed, how they were perceived. And here's 3 examples of videos where I talk about the account of Ahmad ibn Fadlan and his Risala, and how they can be characterized as noble and beautiful, but also disgusting and animal-like. And I try and break up and problematize these popular culture stereotypes of the Vikings. Likewise, I in the middle video I challenge and critique some recent academic scholarship, arguing that the Viking Age was caused by a lack of women, in part caused by female infanticide, and partly by polygamy. And I argue, I identify some problems with those lines of academic argument. And on the right here I'm stitching a linguist who has done an excellent video about the Rurkstone, and I present some further information about what we know about Viking society, their role of social memory and the perception of the past in the Viking Age. I have to combat a lot of interest in Viking militarism and warfare, and fantasies about Vikings as super warriors, which feeds into white supremacist tropes. And here are examples of that. And also an important part of those fantasies are female warriors, Viking warrior women, which has become now a more established academic idea following the work on BJ 581, but remains pernicious in the way it's misrepresented in online spaces. More positively, I look, given there's a huge public interest in Norse paganism and Norse heathenry, or Germanic heathenry more broadly, I try to, through site visits to heritage sites, as well as talking about art and archaeology from the Viking Age, I try to challenge preconceived ideas and present information about the pagan and the conversion to Christianity of the Vikings, Old Norse myth and legend, looking at the materiality of crosses such as a Holton, hogback such as a Hesham, and looking at representations of dragons and how they looked in the Viking Age. And there's a lot of misinformation not only about paganism and its character and its relationship to modern Norse paganism, but also about the nature of Christian conversion. So there's a lot of myths out there about the idea that the Vikings were violently converted by the sword, rather than the more complex long-term interactions we know about from our historical and archaeological sources, in which the Vikings were converting themselves to Christianity and were agents of their own religious and cultural and social and political change. So I talk about that, as well as what we know and what we don't know about gods such as Loki from early medieval art and archaeology, and I also point out the challenges of other modern pop culture uses of the Viking Age, such as and linked to paganism, such as the link between Loki and dinosaur species naming. Here is Loki Ceratops, and a video by a great science communicator on TikTok, Zeke Darwin, and I point out how this creates all manner of confusions about the representation of Loki and the identity of Loki. So, for example, this species was given this name associated with Loki because of its horns, and this is linked to the Marvel Universe representations of the god Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston in the films, rather than anything to do with Loki's characteristics and appearance and qualities from the Viking Age sources of imagery and the medieval literature recalling Loki in stories from the Viking Age and before. There's a lot of interest online in Viking material culture, costumes and bodies, the aesthetics of the Vikings. What did the Vikings look like? How did they dress? And so drawing on new research on body modification, filed teeth, I'm able to both share new information and evidence from the Viking Age, but also combat very recent new aesthetics of the Vikings, focused on cleanliness, beauty, and face paint, tattoos, hairstyles, clothing, and so on. A lot of debunking of modern day myths created by our popular culture and by our own academic community, who have been complicit in sharing a lot of these new stereotypes to replace the old ones of horned helmets and hair, hairy beards and hairy everything. So these new aesthetics of the Vikings are particularly prevalent amongst Viking women. And here are some versions thereof which I've combated. So on the right, a Dutch bodybuilder posing on a reconstructed warship in Norway, valorizing Viking warrior women. We have on the far left, Denmark won the latest Miss Universe competition, and the winner is seen here in an earlier round in carnival style gear that is supposed to embody a Viking goddess. And I did a video responding to this and breaking down what this means and how this may be historically inaccurate, but also where the ideas of the colour scheme, the horns and the general feathery get-up comes from, which isn't explicit in any of the social media put out by the Miss Universe competition, which is of course all about hypersexualized maidens, the Valkyries. And this is very much drawing on 19th century and early 20th century tropes and romance about the Vikings linked to nationalism and white supremacy. Another area of considerable debate linked to gender is Viking warrior women and transgender Vikings, and archaeological evidence has contributed to this debate of problematising our association of masculinity and martial identity, but also has led to some stark misinformation about gender and sex and sexuality in the Viking Age, and I try to navigate that in a way that hopefully is responsible but shares good archaeological information and the limits of inference with our data sets. And likewise, one of the most controversial areas online is fantasies about race, ethnicity and nationalist Vikings. Everyone wants a bit of the Viking pie, both the Nordic nations, but also diaspora white settler communities in North America and Australia, New Zealand and everywhere else, as well as all manner of other peoples want a bit of that Viking world. And it becomes very controversial, both the representation of the Vikings in heritage sites, such as in the middle here, a video I did of the Arab trader as depicted in the 10th century Jorvik displays in York, and that caused massive controversy because a person of colour is shown as part of that Viking world. This leads into challenging misinformation about, from an Afrocentric point of view, of black Vikings. Here me commenting on an AI generated image of black Vikings ruled Ireland and Iceland, through to the use of the Vikings as a point of embarkation into all manner of fantasies and hateful discourses. So a mutual of mine, Steph, an archaeologist who is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, archaeology TikTokers, is here doing a video reflecting on the experience of 1231 years ago, the first recorded Viking raid on Lindisfarne, and as well as people fact checking her for daring to be a woman with knowledge online, and saying maybe it wasn't the first Viking raid. There was a range of people in the comment section making all manner of hateful and xenophobic, racist and sexist comments about, or using the Vikings to as a mirror or a lens onto popular culture today and popular discourse, political discourse today. And I did a series of videos critiquing her comment section and seeing how a perfectly short and informative and reflective post trying to connect people and help people empathise about the past it was hijacked by trolls and hateful discourse. And on the far left, another recent controversy where academic expertise can make a contribution is over the outrage that a woman, a British actor, Nico Parker, who has a Zimbabwean grandmother, has been cast to play a cartoon character in the live action version of How to Train Your Dragon. And everyone's angry that a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed actor is not been picked to play Astrid. Instead, a majority white British actor has been picked who has a mixed heritage. And so my contribution here is into that controversy is to talk about the diversity of the Viking Age, the complexity of the Viking Age, and the likely that people of colour were an integral part of many parts of the Viking Age, and therefore there's nothing historically inaccurate about this, and this is about modern day racist discourses. So this is a way in which we can constructively and responsibly talk about the Vikings in popular culture and engage with those conversations by bringing data and academic thinking that counters hateful misinformation and disinformation. Another such area is the topic of Viking aesthetics, which I've already mentioned, but explicit aspects of it that are culturally appropriative, that are stealing aspects of living traditions amongst indigenous peoples. And two examples of these are chin lines used in cosplay Viking aesthetics, which are directly harmful to indigenous Inuit populations, amongst others, and are feeding into a hypersexualized, hyper-militarized vision of the Vikings, and they're akin to equating pre-modern barbarians of Europe with the savage and the primitive stylization of indigenous communities worldwide. So engaging with this type of topic may seem superficial or to archaeological research, and indeed it's in the very spaces between our confirmed knowledge where people's fantasies can be justified and legitimised. So one account by Ahmad ibn Fadlan and another by Al-Tartusi are used to justify this aesthetic and say we have evidence that Vikings did this, all Vikings did that. And it's important therefore to challenge this and present the evidence, but also present the contemporary harm and context in which these aesthetics are developing and being reproduced. So it's not about saying they're right or wrong without context, it's about using these modern uses and exploring their impact today based on the evidence we have. So it's about being authentic to the past, but also identifying how we can contribute to these current ongoing cultural conversations. Another example is Viking music, Viking metal or soft metal, and various aesthetics of Viking militarism, valorization that bleed into our popular culture. And here I don't simply say, well, this is wrong, we don't have evidence of that, but I've been using the music as a medium to present alternative evidence and reconstruct what we know from archaeological sources, historic sources, later folk music, to challenge these modern Viking metal aesthetics. And these interact and bleed into each other, not only into the physical form of the Vikings, symbols that are claimed to be Viking age when they are much later, such as the Aegis-helmet, and modern sort of metal scene, pirate Vikings as an aesthetic. There's a lot of overlap with ideas of Vikings as pirates, which are perpetuated in popular culture and in academic discourse, and then how we think about what is the impact of this. Some of it is harmless, some of it is mostly harmless, some of it is deeply pernicious that feeds into extremist ideologies and hate groups. But there's a lot of engagement with actual heritage sites, museums, and academic conversations to be had. And I do take people to events, to museums, but I don't do so in a passive way. I try to critique those displays, get people to think through my choice of music, through my choice of language and captions about what we are doing with the Vikings in our contemporary popular culture. And some of it is quite fun, such as videos that mash up a viable, authentic, reconstructed armour and costumes with modern practices such as rollerblading or skateboards and so on. A humorous living history event interaction such as Daleks versus Vikings, and I jokingly do a video stitching this and talking about this is totally inaccurate because of course the Daleks would have done it this way, you know, as a joke, and people putting horned helmets on their sea urchins. So all manner of ways in which we can play with these ideas. Vikings are funny and playful, not all pernicious and dangerous, and so we have to think about the ways we can engage in popular culture and Vikingisms in ways that engage people, allow them to see the variety of ways in which the past and the present link together, from ridiculous AI sort of hoaxes, if you take them seriously, to commercialized products, in this case Viking ice cream, through to reacting to anecdotes people share about meeting tourists. So in this case, a tourist visiting the Viking ship museum where their daughter worked, who had been studying Nordic medieval history, asks the person working at the museum, where are the Vikings now? Do you keep them on a reservation? You know, that kind of, and that's a humorous point of interaction between heritage tourism and various misunderstandings of the Vikings and Vikingisms. The most pernicious are the fact that the Vikings are alive and well, not simply in commercialized and pop culture scenarios, but also in political extremism. And here is an example, 3 examples of videos I've had to do to combat gross and stark misinformation about the Vikings in our popular culture, including in the use of the Vikings in anti-immigrant, xenophobic discourses, and in supporting white nationalist and white supremacist terrorism. Again, with these examples of political extremism, likening on the far left a GB News commentator of some sort, equating immigrants to Viking war bands and saying that we should purge them out as King Alfred did, and my intervention in that case being to point out that that is a gross mischaracterization of even the most patriotic narratives about King Alfred the Great. In the middle, about a hate crime and a terrorist attack on someone who is called by the press an asylum seeker but was actually someone who's been afforded refugee status, and on the right a FBI report about someone who attempted to commit a terrorist attack, inspired or at least dedicating it to Odin, part of that far right misuse of modern Norse paganism to instill hatred against government and against multicultural democratic society. So we see many different ways in which the pernicious use of Vikingisms in our contemporary politics, our rhetorics and our popular culture. And all of that is to give examples of how I've been trying to intervene using my academic expertise, drawing on the expertise of others to deal with, tackle not only misinformation and disinformation about the human past, but the way it's being misused to manipulate political and popular culture narratives today. And this is part of what I would contend with, combining the necro-Vikingism research with this TikTok Vikingisms or digital Vikingisms. These are examples of the broader ways in which we can use our scholarship and our research, our teaching and our public outreach in combination to conduct public Viking research. And this is a theme I've touched on in my publications thus far, here from 2020 in the introduction to my book, Digging Up the Dark Ages. I suggest we need to continue with the task of denouncing false and pseudo-archaeologies, not only because of the misrepresentation of the past, but the knock-on impact this can have on narratives today. But also we must work to create exciting and engaging narratives that challenge existing audiences to think new ways, and to help reach out to new kinds of public who might not otherwise be interested in the Viking Age. And that we need to create re-energized stories that work from grand narratives down to local histories and mobilise by archaeologists to combat misrepresentations and appropriations of the early medieval past, and to do so in ways that are robust but sensitive to particular contexts of use, and do so in sustainable ways that perpetuate positive change. Now, I've already been publishing on these topics a contribution response to Professor Soren Sindbeck in his article in Current Swedish Archaeology, critiquing modern museum displays about the Vikings, pirates in the age of popularism. And I point out that while I agree with Professor Sindbeck's concerns, I think the focus and the character of these debates is misapplied if we're going to focus only on museum exhibits, where a lot of the debates are happening online and elsewhere. And in a paper published in Ellis, Nilsson and Nyzell's Viking Heritage and History in Europe, Practices and Recreations, I present a paper called Towards Public Viking Research, where I argue that we are in a powerful position and an important time to recognise, as using the example here of the Hisham Viking Festival, all manner of contemporary Vikingisms interleave and interact in festivals at a global level, a microcosm of this. The festival is a microcosm of the way in which these different visions of the Vikings interact to sell products, to have fun, to entertain in different registers and different intensities, and overlap with, in this case at Hisham, a rich existing early medieval heritage sites: St Patrick's Chapel, St Peter's Church, and the stone sculpture and archaeological finds of burials and artefacts associated with each. So we have here a good example of the global approach, how global issues within a local framing are the way in which we can both interrogate and critique, but also contribute towards contemporary Vikingisms, fighting fire with fire, not to denounce them all as wrong, but to understand them in that global context. And this leads into my recommendations of how we move forward, how we best do teaching, research and public engagement in the Viking Age. And I think we need to do it in an ethical and responsible fashion, in dialogue with stakeholders, societies, communities, to be responsive and proactive in our engagements. And this comes through in my digital TikToking, that we need to be responding to controversies and debates rather than shying away from them and hiding behind the paywall of peer review and leaving it at statements in press releases. We need to understand the complex integration of tangible and intangible heritage, myth, folklore, legend, story, song, with our archaeological evidence. We need to understand the interface of the digital and the analogue in critiquing and exploring these online Vikingisms and these real-world Vikingisms. That we need to think, as I said, about the contextual, to think locally, linking local communities to global debates and discourses, to challenge and critique both misinformation and disinformation in media, popular culture, and also in academia itself, which is far from separate from these ongoing narratives, and to build engaging narratives that co-opt and combat pseudo-archaeology, misinformation, disinformation on its own terms. So it's not simply about debunking, but engaging and creating new narratives that may work off that misinformation or denounce it. So I hope that gives you a sense of my ongoing perspectives, my research and scholarship on public Viking research, and how I think it has an important contribution alongside with the work of many other scholars to tackling our Viking worlds of today through our research on the distant past.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.